This is part 2 of my video about firmware in society. Now, I've described some of the terrible things which can happen if we make poor decisions about firmware. I've described some of the advantages of open source firmware, better security, visibility, interoperability and longevity. But like it or not, a lot of firmware is closed source. And even firmware which relies on open source code may not actually be released in source form. So it is effectively closed. There are many reasons for this. Companies may worry that releasing their source code may make it easier for their competitors to keep up. They may be embarrassed to release ugly code which has not been developed or maintained using ideal software practices. They may worry about how they might handle, support requests or bug reports. Companies may just feel it is easier to keep their firmware secret and hope for the best. Perhaps no one will notice the security vulnerabilities. As an industry, we need to be realistic. Some companies are better than others at dealing with firmware, and even the best companies can have blobs or pieces which are binary only. Overall, it's not even clear whether firmware is becoming more open or more closed, at least as a proportion of code shipped. So we need to put down our pitchforks and accept that open source firmware will coexist with closed firmware for the foreseeable future. We must do the best job we can while understanding and accepting this reality. So here are my thoughts on a possible path forward. Firstly, let's work together on open standards for how firmware is packaged so that it is possible to see what pieces are included in a product and where they came from. This can include things like software bill of materials and the use of the Binman packaging tool. Secondly, let's figure out a solid update mechanism which makes it easy for users. This may involve firmware updatees silently loading new firmware while the device is running, ready for it to be used automatically when the device is restarted. Thirdly, let's work together on open standards so that it is easy for the open and closed portions to work together as a cohesive whole. This may include efforts such as the firmware handoff protocol and the universal payload specification. Finally, let's try to use open source firmware where feasible, but also accept that it isn't always feasible. We should approach the debate with respect and understanding, accepting commercial constraints and differing points of view. With these points in mind, let's come together as an industry to do the best for our users and make firmware as secure, easy and open as we can.